Rain hammered against the roof of the bus station hard enough to drown out almost every other sound. I sat on a cold metal bench, staring at the last $20 in my wallet. Payday was still 4 days away. My rent was due in a week, my car needed new brakes, and the balance in my checking account was so low I avoided looking at it. The truth was, my life wasn't falling apart. It had already fallen apart. 3 months earlier, my husband had walked out of our apartment carrying 2 suitcases and what little faith I still had in people. The divorce papers had arrived 2 weeks after that. Since then, I'd been working overtime, cutting expenses, and trying to convince myself that starting over at 32 wasn't the end of the world. Some days I believed it. That night wasn't one of those days. I slipped the $20 bill back into my wallet and glanced around the nearly empty station. A young mother was trying to calm a crying toddler. An elderly man slept with his head against the wall. And across from me sat someone I couldn't stop noticing. He looked exhausted. His clothes were worn, his beard was overgrown, his shoes looked like they'd survived better years. But it wasn't his appearance that caught my attention. It was the way he kept staring at the vending machine. Not casually, not out of boredom, the way a hungry person looks at food when they know they can't afford it. Every few seconds, his eyes drifted toward it, then away again. I told myself it wasn't my problem. I told myself I needed that $20. I told myself I couldn't save everyone. But no matter how many excuses I came up with, I couldn't ignore what was sitting right in front of me. Before I could talk myself out of it, I stood. I walked across the station, and I held out the $20 bill. The man looked up at me, confused, then at the money, then back at me. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Finally, he spoke. "Why would you do this?" I shrugged. "Because it looks like you need it more than I do." His eyes stayed on mine. There was something strange about the way he looked at me. Not embarrassment, not pride, almost disbelief, as if kindness was the last thing he'd expected to find that night. Slowly, he accepted the bill. His hand trembled slightly. "Thank you," he said quietly. I smiled. "No problem." Then I returned to my bench and waited for my bus. I never asked his name. He never asked mine. An hour later, his bus arrived. He stood, picked up a worn duffel bag, and headed toward the door. Just before stepping outside, he turned around. Our eyes met one last time, and he said something I'll never forget. "Someday I'll repay you." I laughed. Not because I was rude, because it sounded impossible. The truth was, I didn't expect to ever see him again. As far as I knew, he was just a stranger passing through on a rainy night. A man I'd helped because it felt like the right thing to do. Nothing more, nothing less. At the time, I thought that moment would be forgotten by morning. I was wrong. If you'd met me 6 months before that night at the bus station, you probably wouldn't have recognized me. Not because I looked different, because I was different. Back then, I still believed my life was heading in the right direction. I was married. I had a steady job. I had plans, goals, a future I could picture. Then, everything unraveled. It started with small things, late nights at work, missed phone calls, excuses that didn't quite make sense. At first, I ignored them. Marriage wasn't supposed to be easy, at least that's what everyone said. You work through the difficult seasons, you communicate, you trust each other. So that's what I did. Until the day I came home early from work and discovered I was the only one still fighting for our marriage. The details don't matter anymore. Some betrayals hurt too much to repeat. What matters is that by the time my husband left, he had taken more than our relationship with him. He took my confidence, my sense of security, the future I'd spent years building.
For weeks after the divorce, I moved through life like someone walking through fog. I went to work, paid bills, answered emails, smiled when people expected me to smile. But inside, I felt exhausted, emotionally, mentally, physically. The worst part wasn't losing him. It was realizing how much of myself I'd lost trying to make someone else happy. Every decision suddenly felt heavier. Every expense felt bigger. Every unexpected problem felt like a disaster waiting to happen. One repair bill could throw off my entire month. One missed paycheck could become a crisis. There was no safety net, no backup plan, just me. I rented a small apartment on the other side of town, the kind of place that wasn't terrible, but wasn't somewhere anyone planned to stay forever. The walls were thin, the appliances were old, and every month rent seemed to rise faster than my paycheck. Still, I was grateful to have it, because after the divorce, gratitude became a survival skill. You stop focusing on what you've lost, you focus on what you've managed to keep. A roof, a job, a chance to start over, even if starting over felt terrifying. Most mornings I left home before sunrise. Most evenings I returned after dark. I worked as an administrative assistant for a growing consulting company downtown. The work wasn't glamorous, but I was good at it. I kept projects organized, solved problems before they became emergencies, and made sure deadlines were met. Half the office depended on me, whether they realized it or not. The problem was that being dependable often makes people take you for granted. The harder I worked, the more work I seemed to receive. The more responsibilities I accepted, the more invisible my efforts became. My manager constantly promised promotions, constantly praised my dedication, constantly told me my opportunity was coming. Yet somehow that opportunity never arrived. Someone else always got the raise. Someone else always got the recognition. Someone else always got the credit. Meanwhile, I kept working because I needed the paycheck, because quitting wasn't an option, because life doesn't pause while you're rebuilding it. By the time that rainy night at the bus station arrived, I felt stretched so thin that one more setback might have broken me completely. I didn't know it then, but I was standing at a crossroads. One small decision was about to connect my future to a complete stranger, and neither of us had any idea what was coming next.
Looking back, I almost didn't go to the bus station that night. My car had started making a strange grinding noise earlier that week. The mechanic's estimate was more than I could afford, so instead of driving across town to visit a former coworker, I decided to take the bus. At the time, it felt like another reminder of how much my life had changed. A year earlier, I wouldn't have thought twice about paying for a repair. Now, every dollar required a decision. Every purchase came with consequences. The rain had started shortly after sunset. By the time I reached the station, the storm was in full force. Water ran down the windows in thick streams. The wind rattled the doors every few minutes. Most people looked annoyed, tired, ready to get home. I remember pulling my jacket tighter and checking the time for what felt like the 100th time. My bus was delayed. 30 minutes became 45, then an hour. The station slowly emptied. One by one, people disappeared into the night. A few remained: the young mother with her toddler, the elderly man sleeping against the wall, and the stranger sitting across from me. At first, I didn't pay much attention to him. I was too busy worrying about my own problems. But the longer we sat there, the harder he became to ignore. There was something unusual about him, not because of his clothes, not because of his appearance, because of the way he carried himself. Even sitting alone in worn-out clothes, he didn't seem defeated. Exhausted, yes, but not defeated. His posture was straight. His movements were deliberate. His eyes constantly observed everything around him.
almost as if he wasn't accustomed to feeling powerless. Several times I noticed him reach into his pocket. Each time, he pulled his hand back empty. Then his attention would return to the vending machine. The machine sat near the entrance, bright lights, rows of snacks, simple things most people wouldn't think twice about. But every time he looked at it, I saw the same expression: hunger, the kind that goes beyond missing a meal, the kind that comes from not knowing where the next one is coming from. I tried to ignore it, I really did. I had enough problems of my own. The $20 in my wallet wasn't extra money, it wasn't spare change. It was gas money, lunch money, emergency money. The difference between getting through the week comfortably and struggling through it. Yet the more I thought about it, the worse I felt. Because no matter how difficult things were for me, they clearly weren't as difficult as they were for him. I watched him stare at that machine again, and something inside me wouldn't let it go. Maybe it was because I had spent the past year learning how quickly life can change. Maybe it was because I knew what it felt like to need help and not receive it. Or maybe it was simply because kindness doesn't always arrive when it's convenient. Sometimes it arrives when it's costly. Before I could change my mind, I stood. My heart actually started racing, which sounds ridiculous now, but when you're counting every dollar, giving away 20 of them feels bigger than people realize. I walked toward him. The bill folded tightly in my hand. When I stopped in front of him, he looked up. His expression immediately shifted to confusion. I held out the bill. For a moment, he just stared at it, then at me, then back at the bill again. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "What's this for?" His voice was deeper than I expected, calm, measured. I offered a small smile. "It looks like you could use it." His eyes narrowed slightly, not suspicious, surprised, as though nobody had said something like that to him in a very long time. "You don't even know me." I laughed softly. "No, but I know what being hungry looks like." For a second, something changed in his expression. Something vulnerable, something almost painful. Then it disappeared. He looked down at the bill again. "I can't take this." "You can?" "No." "Yes." A small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. It was the first sign of life I'd seen him all evening. "You always this stubborn?" "Only when I'm right." That earned a quiet laugh. Eventually, he accepted the money. Not quickly, not comfortably, but he accepted it, as if he understood refusing would only insult the gesture. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked a question I wasn't expecting. "What makes you believe people deserve kindness?" I thought about it. Not long, just long enough. Then I answered honestly. Because life is already hard enough without us making it harder for each other. The station fell silent again. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. The stranger stared at me for a moment longer, and for reasons I couldn't explain, it felt like he was memorizing every word. For the next few minutes, neither of us said much. The stranger used part of the money to buy a sandwich and a bottle of water from the vending machine. Then he returned to his seat. I expected him to eat immediately. Instead, he sat quietly for a moment, staring at the sandwich in his hands, as though he was thinking about something far bigger than food. The storm outside continued to rage. Rain struck the windows, wind howled around the building, but somehow the station felt calmer than it had all night. Maybe because neither of us felt completely alone anymore. Eventually, he opened the sandwich. After taking a few bites, he looked over at me. "You should have kept the money." I smiled. "Probably. You said payday isn't until next week." I raised an eyebrow. "You were listening? You weren't exactly whispering when you checked your balance on the phone." I groaned. "Great." A faint smile crossed his face. "Things that bad?" For a second, I considered giving the polite answer, the answer people usually give. The answer that says everything is fine when it clearly isn't. Instead, I told the truth. They've been better. He nodded. Not with pity, with understanding. The difference mattered. Most people either judged you for struggling or felt sorry for you. He did neither. Still, he said, you gave away your last $20. I shrugged. It wasn't my last $20. He looked confused. It was the last $20 in my wallet. That finally earned a genuine laugh, the first real laugh I'd heard from him all evening. And for a moment, he looked completely different, lighter, younger, less burdened. Then the weight returned to his eyes. I recognized it immediately. The look of someone carrying more than they know how to put down. We sat in silence again. Not awkward silence, comfortable silence. The kind that sometimes happens between strangers who know they'll never meet again. Finally, he spoke. Can I ask you something? Sure. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why are you still smiling? I frowned. What do you mean? He leaned back slightly. Your car is broken. Okay. Your finances are stretched. True. You've obviously had a rough year. I laughed softly. That's one way to describe it. He nodded. So why are you still smiling? The question caught me off guard. Nobody had ever asked me that before. I looked down at my hands, thought about it, then answered honestly. Because if I lose that too, then what do I have left? For a moment, he didn't respond. His expression changed, not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. As if my answer had struck something deep inside him, something personal, something painful. Outside, lightning flashed across the sky. For a second, the station glowed white. Then darkness returned. The stranger looked toward the window. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter. Not everyone thinks like that. Maybe they should. His eyes met mine, and for the first time all night, I saw emotion there. Real emotion. Not sadness, not anger. Gratitude. The kind that's difficult to put into words. A few minutes later, a loudspeaker crackled overhead. His bus had arrived. I expected him to stand immediately. Instead, he remained seated, almost as if he wasn't ready for the moment to end. Finally, he picked up his worn duffel bag. He stood, then looked down at me. Thank you. I smiled. You're welcome. He hesitated, as though there was something else he wanted to say, something important. Finally, he nodded. Someday I'll repay you. I laughed, not because I wanted to hurt his feelings, because the statement sounded impossible. He didn't laugh. Instead, he offered a small smile, one that somehow made me think he wasn't joking. Then he turned and walked toward the door. I watched him disappear into the storm. A few moments later, the bus pulled away. And just like that, he was gone. No name, no phone number, no way to ever find him again. Just a stranger I'd met on a rainy night. A stranger who seemed oddly certain our paths would cross again. I shook my head and smiled to myself. Then I gathered my things and waited for my own bus, completely unaware that the brief encounter I almost talked myself out of was about to become one of the most important moments of my life.
The next morning, life continued exactly as it had before. At least that's what I thought. My alarm went off at 6. I got dressed, grabbed coffee from the small machine on my kitchen counter, and headed to work. The encounter at the bus station stayed in the back of my mind, but only as a passing memory. A strange moment during a difficult year. Nothing more, nothing less. By lunchtime, I was buried in emails. By afternoon, I was solving problems that technically weren't part of my job. By evening, I was exhausted. Just another day, then another, and another. Weeks passed. Eventually, the stranger became a story I occasionally remembered,
usually when life felt particularly frustrating. I would think about the look on his face when I handed him the $20, the disbelief, the gratitude, the way he seemed genuinely surprised that someone would help him. It reminded me that kindness still mattered, even when nobody noticed, especially when nobody noticed. The funny thing about life is that we often expect important moments to announce themselves. We think life-changing events arrive with warning signs, big speeches, dramatic music, clear signals that something significant is happening. But most of the time, they don't. Most life-changing moments look ordinary while they're happening. A conversation, a decision, a choice that seems insignificant until years later. The stranger slowly faded into the background of my memory. Work became my focus again. The company was growing quickly, new clients, new projects, new responsibilities. But despite all the growth, my own career seemed stuck. I trained new employees, managed schedules, fixed mistakes, handled emergencies, and somehow remained exactly where I'd started. My manager, Richard, had a talent for making promises. Every few months, he'd call me into his office, tell me how valuable I was, tell me how much he appreciated my dedication, tell me a promotion was right around the corner. Then nothing happened. The promotion would go to someone else, the raise would go to someone else, the recognition would go to someone else. At first, I told myself to be patient. Success takes time. Hard work eventually pays off. That's what people always say. But after 3 years, patience starts feeling a lot like being taken advantage of. One afternoon, I watched a coworker receive credit for a project I'd spent weeks organizing. Everyone applauded, everyone congratulated him. Meanwhile, I sat quietly in the back of the conference room, pretending it didn't bother me. The truth was, it bothered me a lot. Not because I wanted attention, because I wanted fairness. Because it would have been nice for someone to notice. When the meeting ended, one of my coworkers stopped beside my desk. "You okay?" I forced a smile. "Of course." She looked unconvinced. "You deserve better than this place." I laughed. Maybe. The problem was that finding another job wasn't simple. Bills still existed, responsibilities still existed. Adult life rarely gives you the luxury of walking away without a plan. So I stayed, month after month, year after year, doing my best, trying to believe things would eventually improve. Then, one Monday morning, everything changed. The email arrived shortly after 9. Company-wide announcement, mandatory staff meeting, attendance required, no exceptions. At first, nobody knew what was happening. Rumors spread immediately. A merger, layoffs, restructuring, new ownership. By lunchtime, the entire office was buzzing with speculation. And for the first time in years, even Richard looked nervous. Something was coming. Something big. None of us knew it yet, but a man I hadn't seen in 3 years was already on his way back into my life. The mandatory meeting was scheduled for Friday morning. By Thursday afternoon, nobody was getting any real work done. Every conversation eventually circled back to the same question. What was happening? Theories spread through the office like wildfire. Some people were convinced layoffs were coming, others believed the company had been sold. A few optimistic employees thought promotions might finally be on the horizon. Personally, I didn't know what to think. I just hoped I still had a job when the dust settled. After everything I'd been through, uncertainty had become exhausting. Friday arrived faster than expected. The atmosphere felt different the moment I stepped into the building. People were dressed more formally than usual. Managers were moving quickly through the hallways. Groups of employees stood whispering near the elevators. Even Richard looked tense. That alone told me something serious was happening. I had worked with him long enough to know he usually carried himself with complete confidence. That morning, confidence was nowhere to be found. At 10 o'clock, everyone gathered in the largest conference room. Every chair was occupied. Employees lined the walls. The usual chatter filled the room. Speculation, nervous laughter,
questions nobody could answer. I took a seat near the back, close enough to see, far enough away to avoid attention. A few minutes later, the company's president stepped onto the stage. The room immediately fell silent. He looked serious, not worried, just serious. The kind of expression leaders wear when they're about to deliver news that changes everything. He adjusted the microphone, then smiled. I know everyone has questions. A few nervous laughs echoed through the room. I'll save you the suspense. Now everyone was paying attention, including me. The president took a breath. As of this week, the company has officially been acquired. The room exploded. Whispers, gasps, confused looks. People immediately started talking over each other. The president raised a hand. Please, let me finish. Gradually, the room settled again. The new ownership group believes strongly in the future of this company and intends to invest heavily in its growth. That sounded promising. At least nobody mentioned layoffs. Yet. Then came the next announcement. The new owner will be taking a direct leadership role as chief executive officer. More whispers, more speculation. I glanced around the room. Everyone seemed equally curious. Nobody appeared to know who the new CEO was, not even senior management. The new CEO will be joining us this morning. That got everyone's attention, including Richard's. His posture stiffened immediately. Interesting. The president smiled. I'll allow him to introduce himself. Then he stepped aside. The room became completely silent. A side door opened. Footsteps echoed across the floor, and a tall man entered the conference room. At first, I wasn't paying much attention. I expected another executive, another businessman in an expensive suit, another corporate leader delivering another corporate speech. Then I looked up, and everything inside me stopped. The room disappeared, the voices disappeared, the people disappeared. For a moment, all I could do was stare, because I knew that face. Not from a company website, not from a business magazine, from a rainy night 3 years earlier. The beard was gone, the worn clothes were gone, the exhaustion was gone. But it was him, the stranger from the bus station, the man I'd never expected to see again. The man who had walked into the storm carrying a duffel bag and a $20 bill. My heart started pounding. No, that was impossible. I blinked, then blinked again. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe stress was playing tricks on me. But the longer I looked, the more certain I became. It was him. Somehow, someway, the stranger had become the CEO of my company. And as he stepped towards the podium, his eyes slowly moved across the room, greeting faces, scanning employees, learning names. Then suddenly his gaze stopped, directly on me. For one brief moment, his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Recognition. The same recognition I felt. And in that instant, I knew something that nobody else in the room knew. He remembered me. For the rest of the meeting, I barely heard a word. The new CEO introduced himself as Ethan Cole. He spoke about growth, about opportunity, about building a stronger company. The room hung on every word. Meanwhile, I was sitting there trying to process one impossible fact. The man standing at the podium was the same stranger from the bus station. 3 years. 3 years, and somehow our paths had crossed again. When the meeting finally ended, employees immediately gathered into small groups. Everyone had opinions. Everyone had theories. Everyone wanted to know more about the new CEO. I stayed in my chair longer than everyone else, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. Eventually, I returned to my desk. Unfortunately, my coworkers noticed something was wrong almost immediately. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I laughed nervously. I just got surprised. By what? I hesitated. Part of me knew how ridiculous this was going to sound. The other part couldn't keep it to myself. "I think I've met him before." 3 coworkers immediately looked up. "The CEO?" I nodded. "When?" I took a deep breath. 3 years ago. Silence.
Then laughter. Not cruel laughter. The kind people give when they assume you're joking. One coworker shook his head. Sure you did. I'm serious. Another laughed. Okay, let me guess. You were college friends? No. Distant relatives? No. They waited. I sighed. We met at a bus station. That made them laugh even harder. Now I felt ridiculous. Even saying it out loud sounded unbelievable. A bus station? Yes. You expect us to believe the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company was hanging around a bus station? I folded my arms. At the time, he wasn't dressed like a CEO. More laughter. One coworker leaned against my desk. So what happened? I debated whether I should tell them, then decided there was no point in hiding it. I gave him $20. The entire group stared at me. Then one of them burst out laughing again. You gave the CEO money? He wasn't a CEO then. Apparently. Another coworker smiled. If that's true, maybe he'll make you vice president. The group laughed. I forced a smile. But inside, I felt strangely frustrated because I knew what I saw. I knew who he was, and I knew he had recognized me too. The look on his face had lasted only a second. Most people probably missed it. I didn't. The conversation eventually died down. Everyone returned to work, but my focus was gone. Every time my phone rang, I jumped. Every time someone walked past my desk, I looked up. Part of me expected Ethan to appear. Part of me hoped he wouldn't. The entire situation felt unreal. By late afternoon, I finally managed to convince myself I was overthinking everything. Maybe he recognized someone behind me. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the similarities were coincidences. Then my office phone rang. I answered automatically. This is Ava. Good afternoon, Ava. The voice was calm, professional, unknown. Mr. Cole's office would like to schedule a meeting with you. My stomach dropped. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. I'm sorry? The CEO would like to meet with you. I glanced around the office. Nobody else seemed to notice. When? The assistant checked something. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Tomorrow. Not next week, not next month. Tomorrow. Out of hundreds of employees, the new CEO wanted to meet with me, personally. My pulse started racing. Is there a reason? There was a brief pause. Then the assistant answered. Mr. Cole didn't specify. The call ended a few moments later. I slowly lowered the phone, trying to process what had just happened. Across the room, one of my coworkers noticed my expression. What happened? I stared at her, then finally spoke. The CEO wants to meet with me. The entire office went silent, and suddenly, nobody was laughing anymore. I barely slept that night. Every possible scenario ran through my head. Maybe Ethan wanted information about the company. Maybe he was meeting with multiple employees. Maybe it had nothing to do with the bus station at all. The more I thought about it, the less sense any of it made. By morning, I had convinced myself to stay calm. It was a meeting, nothing more, nothing less. Still, my hands felt slightly unsteady as I rode the elevator to the executive floor. I'd never been there before. Most employees hadn't. The upper level was reserved for senior leadership. The carpets were thicker. The offices were larger. Even the atmosphere felt different, quieter, more controlled, as if everyone there carried the weight of important decisions. The receptionist greeted me with a warm smile. Mr. Cole is expecting you. Those words somehow made me even more nervous. I sat in the waiting area and checked the clock. 8:59, 8:59, 9 o'clock. A moment later, Ethan's office door opened. He stepped into the hallway. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. Not the polished smile he'd used during the company meeting, a real one. Ava. The way he said my name immediately answered the question I'd been asking myself for 24 hours. He remembered. Completely. Good morning, I managed. His smile widened. It's good to see you again. Again. Not nice to meet you. Not welcome. Again. The word alone made my heart race. He motioned toward his office. Come in. The office was impressive without being flashy. Large windows overlooked the city. Bookshelves lined one wall. Several framed photographs sat on a crescenda. But what caught my attention wasn't the office. It was the frame sitting on his desk. At first, I thought it was a photograph. Then I looked closer and froze. Inside the frame was a $20 bill. My $20 bill. The exact bill I had handed him 3 years earlier. I stared at it, certain I had to be mistaken. Then Ethan noticed where I was looking. His expression softened. You recognize it? I looked from the frame to him. You kept it? He nodded. Every emotion I'd been trying to suppress suddenly rushed to the surface. Shock, confusion, disbelief. Why? For a moment, Ethan didn't answer. He walked toward the window, looked out over the city, then slowly turned back toward me. Because it changed my life. I stared at him, unable to find words. He gave a small laugh. I know how dramatic that sounds. A little. That earns a genuine smile. Then his expression became serious again. Ava, when you met me, I was at the lowest point of my life. I remembered the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he'd stared at the vending machine, the weight he seemed to carry. But none of that explains this. None of it explained the office, the company, the success, the man standing in front of me now. As if reading my thoughts, Ethan gestured toward a chair. I owe you an explanation. I sat down, and for the next hour, Ethan told me a story I never could have imagined. A story about betrayal, loss, failure, and a journey that somehow led him all the way back to me. What I didn't realize yet was that his story was about to reveal something else, something happening inside this company, something that would change both of our lives all over again. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. I sat across from Ethan, still trying to understand how the hungry stranger from the bus station had become the CEO sitting in front of me. Meanwhile, he stared at the framed $20 bill, almost as if he was looking at a completely different time in his life. Finally, he exhaled. When you met me, I wasn't broke. I frowned. Then why were you at a bus station? A small smile crossed his face. I was running away. That wasn't the answer I expected. Ethan leaned back in his chair. 3 years earlier, he had owned a successful consulting company. Not this company, a different one. One he had spent nearly 15 years building. Long hours, missed vacations, sleepless nights, sacrifices most people never saw. The company eventually became successful, very successful. Then, everything fell apart. His business partner betrayed him, someone he'd known for years, someone he trusted, someone he considered family. The betrayal didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, quietly. Money disappeared, contracts vanished, clients were redirected elsewhere. By the time Ethan discovered the truth, the damage had already been done. Lawsuits followed, investigations followed, and suddenly the company he'd spent years building was collapsing around him. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened afterward. When things became difficult, people started leaving. Friends disappeared. Business associates stopped returning calls. People who once praised him suddenly acted as though they'd never known him. I nodded slowly. Unfortunately, I understood that feeling. Hard times have a way of revealing who people really are. Ethan continued. His marriage didn't survive the chaos. Neither did most of his relationships. Within a year, almost everything he'd built was gone. The company, the marriage, the reputation he'd spent years creating. I remembered the exhaustion in his eyes that night. Suddenly, it made sense. I wasn't hungry because I couldn't afford food, he said quietly. I was hungry because I hadn't eaten in 2 days. That surprised me. Why? A faint smile appeared. Because I stopped caring. The honesty in his answer hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I saw the man from the bus station again. The version of Ethan hidden beneath the expensive suit. The version carrying enough pain to make someone forget to take care of themselves. I thought my life was over, he admitted. I thought everything I'd worked for had been taken away. The room fell silent. Then he laughed softly. And then some stubborn woman walked up and handed me $20. I couldn't help smiling. You make it sound dramatic. It was dramatic. His expression grew serious again. You didn't know who I was. I nodded. No. You didn't expect anything. No. You just helped. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan said something I would never forget. Do you know how rare that is? I looked down. Honestly, I'd never thought much about it. To me, it had been a simple decision, a small act of kindness, nothing extraordinary. Apparently, Ethan saw it differently. Most people help when there's something to gain. His voice was calm. Status, connections, recognition. He shook his head. You didn't even ask my name. I laughed. Maybe I should have. That earned another smile. Then Ethan stood and walked toward the window. The city stretched beneath us. Busy streets, glass towers, thousands of people moving through their lives. When I got back on my feet, I promised myself something. I looked up. What? He turned toward me. If I ever had the chance, I'd find the woman who reminded me that decent people still exist. For a second, emotion tightened in my chest. Not because of the compliment, because of the sincerity behind it. He truly meant it. Then Ethan's expression changed, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for me to notice. The warmth faded, concern replaced it, and suddenly the conversation shifted. Finding you wasn't actually as difficult as you think. I frowned. What does that mean? Ethan returned to his desk, slowly sat down, then folded his hands. Because after I bought this company, your name kept appearing everywhere. I blinked. My name? He nodded. Every project, every successful department, every crisis that somehow got solved before it became a disaster, the same name kept showing up. Now I was confused. I don't understand. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. That's exactly what I said. Then he opened a file sitting on his desk. And what he showed me next would reveal a problem inside the company much bigger than either of us realized. I stared at the file sitting on Ethan's desk, then back at him, then back at the file again. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be looking at. Ethan slid it across the desk. Take a look. Slowly, I opened it. The first few pages contained project reports, performance reviews, department summaries. Nothing unusual, at least not at first. Then I started recognizing names, my projects, my schedules, my work. Page after page, month after month, year after year. The further I read, the more confused I became. Because while the work was mine, the credit wasn't. Different names appeared everywhere. Managers, supervisors, department heads. People receiving recognition for accomplishments they hadn't actually achieved. My stomach tightened. I flipped another page, then another, then another. Each one told the same story. Tasks I completed, problems I solved, systems I created. Yet someone else's name sat at the top. Someone else collected the praise. Someone else collected the bonuses. Someone else built a reputation using work that wasn't theirs. I looked up. Ethan, his expression remains calm. Keep reading. So I did. A few pages later, I found Richard's name. Then another. Then another. Again and again. The deeper I went, the worse it became. By the time I reached the end of the file, my hands felt numb. This can't be right. Unfortunately, Ethan didn't look surprised. I had the same reaction. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I struggled to process what I was seeing, not because I believed Ethan was lying, because I finally understood why my career had felt stuck for so long. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't bad timing. It wasn't a lack of talent. Someone had been standing on my shoulders for years, and I'd never realized it. Ethan leaned forward. When I purchased the company, I reviewed every department. I listened quietly. At first, your name appeared as support staff. I nodded. That was my official title. Then I started looking closer. His eyes narrowed. The numbers didn't make sense. I frowned. What numbers? Productivity. He opened another folder. This one contained charts, performance reports, financial summaries, things far above my pay grade. Every successful project somehow connected back to you. My confusion deepened. Ethan continued. Whenever a department improved, your involvement appeared somewhere in the background. Another chart, another report, another example. The pattern became impossible to ignore. You solved problems before managers even knew they existed. He pointed toward another page. You trained employees. Another page. You handled client emergencies. Another. You redesigned internal systems. Another. You increased efficiency. Another. You prevented costly mistakes. I sat there speechless. Not because he was wrong, because nobody had ever said it out loud before. Nobody. For years, my contributions had been treated like ordinary expectations, not achievements, just expectations. The room remains quiet. Then Ethan asked a question. Ava, why haven't you left? I laughed softly, not because it was funny, because I honestly didn't know anymore. I needed the paycheck. He nodded. Fair. I kept believing things would change. That earned a smaller nod. And maybe part of me thought if I worked hard enough, eventually somebody would notice. The words hung in the air. Then Ethan smiled. For a second, emotion tightened in my throat. I quickly looked away. Professionalism suddenly felt very difficult. Ethan gave me a moment before continuing. There's another problem. My attention returned immediately. What problem? His expression darkened. The deeper I investigated, the more irregularities I found. I frowned. What kind of irregularities? He opened another file. This one looked much thicker, much more serious. And judging by Ethan's face, whatever was inside wasn't going to be good news. Then he turned the folder around. The first name I saw was Richard's, and suddenly I understood why Ethan had asked to meet with me. This wasn't just about recognition anymore. Something much bigger was happening inside the company, and Richard was right in the middle of it. I stared at Richard's name on the file. For years, he'd been my manager. For years, I'd trusted him. Maybe not completely, but enough to believe he was being honest when he promised promotions and opportunities. Now, I wasn't so sure. What exactly did he do? I asked. Ethan folded his hands. At first, I thought it was simple favoritism. I listened carefully. But the deeper we looked, the worse it became. He opened another report. This one contained performance evaluations. My evaluations. I immediately recognized them. Most were annual reviews, the kind employees receive every year. Then I noticed something strange. Comments had been altered. Achievements were missing. Entire projects had disappeared from the records. I frowned. I never saw these versions. You weren't supposed to. My stomach tightened. Ethan continued. Several original reports were modified after submission. I looked up. Modified by who? You already know the answer. Richard. The realization hit harder than I expected because suddenly everything made sense. The missed promotions, the denied raises, the constant promises that never became reality. Every time I had gotten close to moving forward, someone had quietly pulled me back. And that someone was Richard. I looked down at the paperwork again. Part of me wanted to be angry. Part of me wanted to cry. Mostly, I felt exhausted. 3 years. 3 years of believing I simply wasn't doing enough. 3 years of wondering why everyone else seemed to move ahead while I stayed in place. 3 years of blaming myself. Ethan slid another document toward me. This one made my jaw tighten. Bonus distributions. Names, amounts, dates. Several major project bonuses had been approved over the years. Bonuses connected directly to projects I managed, projects I built, projects I saved. Yet my name appeared nowhere. Richard's did. Repeatedly, along with several managers who had barely participated. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just stared. The numbers weren't life-changing, but together they represented thousands of dollars. Money I could have used. Money that would have helped during some very difficult years. Money that had never reached me. I don't understand. Ethan's voice remained calm. Neither did I. He leans back slightly, which is why I kept investigating. The room fell silent. Then he said something unexpected. Richard doesn't know. I blinked. Doesn't know what? That we know. For the first time all morning, I saw something almost strategic in Ethan's expression. The look of someone putting pieces together. The look of someone waiting. He's still operating as though nothing has changed. Now I understood. The investigation wasn't over. Not yet. Ethan opened a final folder. Inside were emails, internal messages, approval requests, documents. Lots of documents. Far more than I could process in one sitting. Over the last 2 weeks, we've been monitoring every decision. My eyes widened slightly. Ethan nodded. Carefully. He tapped one particular page, then read. And as I read, my disbelief slowly turned into shock because Richard wasn't just taking credit anymore. He was trying to do it again, right now, with another major project. The same scheme, the same manipulation, the same deception. Only this time, someone was watching. And Richard had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. The following Monday felt strangely normal. Employees arrived carrying coffee, meetings filled calendars, phones rang, emails piled up. On the surface, it looked like every other workday. But beneath that routine, something was happening, something Richard knew nothing about. I tried focusing on work. I really did. Unfortunately, every time I looked at him, I remembered the files, the altered evaluations, the stolen bonuses, the years of deception. And somehow, Richard acted exactly the same as always, confident, relaxed, completely unaware. Around 11 o'clock, he stopped by my desk. Ava? I looked up. Yes? I'll need the final project report by this afternoon. The request itself wasn't unusual. The irony was, because I already knew exactly what he planned to do with it, the same thing he'd done countless times before. Take credit, collect praise, move forward while someone else did the work. For the first time in years, I wasn't frustrated. I was curious. Curious to see how long his confidence would last. "Sure," I said. "I'll send it shortly." He smiled and walked away. By 2 o'clock, the executive conference room was full. Department heads, senior managers, leadership teams, including Richard. The project he'd been claiming responsibility for was scheduled for review. The same project Ethan had been investigating. The same project Richard believed would strengthen his reputation. Employees weren't usually invited to meetings like this. Yet somehow I found myself sitting quietly along the wall, not participating, just observing. Ethan entered a few minutes later. The room immediately fell silent. He greeted everyone politely, then took his seat. At first, the meeting proceeded normally. Performance metrics, growth projections, budget discussions, nothing unusual. Then they reached Richard's project. Richard stood confidently, as expected. He launched into a polished presentation. Charts, results, achievements, success stories. Anyone watching would have assumed he personally carried the project from beginning to end. Several executives nodded approvingly. A few even complimented him. Richard accepted the praise effortlessly, as though he'd earned every bit of it. Then Ethan spoke. "Excellent presentation." Richard smiled. "Thank you." Ethan folded his hands. "I have a few questions." Something in his tone made the room noticeably quieter. Richard's smile remained, but it seemed slightly less certain. "Of course." Ethan opened a folder. "The scheduling system redesign." Richard nodded. "Yes. You created that?" "Correct." Ethan glanced at another page. "The client recovery process." "Also my team." Another page. "The emergency response protocol." Richard hesitated briefly, then nodded. "Yes." The room remained silent. Ethan looked up directly at him. "Interesting." For the first time, Richard appeared uncomfortable, only slightly, but enough to notice. Ethan opened another file, then another, then another. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Questions became more specific, more detailed. Richard's answers became less confident. Then Ethan began displaying emails, internal records, project logs, approval histories, one by one. The room watched as a completely different story emerged, a story built on facts, not presentations. Facts, names, dates, documents, evidence, lots of evidence. Richard's confidence slowly disappeared. The executives noticed, so did everyone else. Then came the moment that changed everything. Ethan displayed a project timeline on the screen. Every major contribution was listed, every task documented, every employee identified, and beside nearly every critical milestone appeared the same name, Ava Reynolds. The room became completely silent. Someone actually leaned forward to look closer, then another, then another. Suddenly, people were seeing what Ethan had seen, the pattern, the truth, the years of hidden work. Richard's face tightened. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Would you like to explain why Miss Reynolds completed most of this work while your reports repeatedly credited you?" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since I'd known him, he had absolutely nothing to say, and everyone in the room knew exactly why. Nobody came to Richard's defense. Not a single person. The silence in the room felt heavier than any argument could have. For years, Richard had controlled the narrative. For years, he had been the one explaining results, presenting successes, accepting praise. Now, the facts were speaking for themselves, and facts are difficult to argue with. Richard tried, of course he did. He claimed it was a misunderstanding. Then he claimed it was delegation. Then he claimed leadership required coordinating talented employees. Each explanation sounded weaker than the last, especially once Ethan began presenting more evidence. Additional emails, additional reports, additional records. Every document told the same story. Ava did the work, Richard accepted the credit, over and over again. The executives weren't angry, they looked disappointed, which somehow seemed worse. One by one, questions were asked. Questions Richard couldn't answer. Questions supported by documentation. Questions supported by facts. Eventually, the meeting ended. Not with a dramatic outburst, not with security escorting anyone from the building, just quiet certainty, the kind that comes when the truth is no longer in doubt. As employees filed out of the room, conversations immediately started. Whispers, speculation, shock. Most people weren't discussing Richard, they were discussing me, which felt even stranger. For years, I had worked quietly in the background. Now, everyone suddenly seemed to know my name. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Relieved, embarrassed, overwhelmed? Probably all three. As I gathered my things, Ethan approached. "You okay?" I laughed softly. "Honestly? Honestly? No." That earned a smile. Fair answer. I looked around the room. Most people had already left, only a few executives remained. What happens now? Ethan considered the question. That depends. On what? On whether you're finally willing to stop acting like you're invisible. I stared at him. For a second, I wasn't sure how to respond, because part of me had become comfortable being overlooked. Not because I enjoyed it, because it felt safer. If nobody expected much, nobody could be disappointed. If nobody noticed you, nobody could criticize you. You learn strange survival habits when you've spent a long time being carried responsibilities that belong to other people. Ethan seemed to understand exactly what I was thinking. You've spent a long time carrying responsibilities that belong to other people. I nodded slowly. Maybe. No, he smiled. Definitely. For the first time all day, I found myself laughing. A genuine laugh. Not a polite one, not a forced one. A real one. The kind that hadn't happened nearly enough over the past few years. Then Ethan handed me a folder. I looked down at it, confused. What's this? Open it. Slowly I did. Inside was an offer letter. My eyes widened, then widened again, because the title printed at the top wasn't administrative assistant, it wasn't coordinator, it wasn't supervisor. It was director of operations. I stared at the page, certain I had misread it. Then I read it again and again. Still the same title, still the same offer. Still impossible. Ethan, I raised a hand before I could finish. You earned it. The room suddenly felt very quiet. For years, promotions had always been just out of reach. For years, recognition had always gone somewhere else. Now it was sitting in my hands, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. I don't want special treatment. The words escaped before I could stop them. Ethan's expression softened. This isn't special treatment. He pointed toward the stack of reports still sitting on the conference table. This is correction. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I looked back down at the offer letter, at the title, at the opportunity, at the future that suddenly looked very different from the what I'd imagined that morning. And for the first time in a very long time, I allowed myself to believe something better might actually be possible. The promotion became official 2 weeks later. Even then, part of me expected someone to tell me there had been a mistake, that the paperwork was wrong, that someone had changed their mind. Years of disappointment have a way of teaching you not to trust good news too quickly. But this time, the good news stayed. The announcement went out company-wide on a Monday morning. By lunchtime, my inbox was overflowing. Congratulations, well deserved, about time. Some messages came from people I knew.
Others came from employees I'd barely spoken to before. Apparently, a lot more people had noticed my work than I'd realized. They simply hadn't known the full story. Neither had I. The transition into my new role was overwhelming at first. There were larger responsibilities, bigger decisions, more visibility, more pressure. But there was also something else: respect. For the first time in years, people weren't treating me like someone who existed in the background. They listened when I spoke. They asked for my opinion. They trusted in my judgment. The strange thing was that my work hadn't changed very much. I was still solving problems, still organizing projects, still helping teams succeed. The difference was that people finally recognized it. One afternoon, a former coworker stopped by my office. I still wasn't used to having an office. Even months later, it felt surreal. "You know what's funny?" she asked. "What?" "You always did this job." I laughed. "That's not entirely true." "It kind of is." She looked around. "The title changed, the office changed, but you've been carrying this company for years." After she left, I sat quietly for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened. Maybe she was right. Maybe the biggest change wasn't my position. Maybe the biggest change was finally believing in my own value. Meanwhile, Ethan continued transforming the company. New systems were introduced, departments became more efficient, employee satisfaction improved, turnover dropped. For the first time in a long while, people seemed excited to come to work. And despite how busy he was, Ethan somehow always found time to check in. Sometimes it was about a project, sometimes it was about a client, sometimes it was about nothing important at all. At least, that's what I told myself. The truth was, I started looking forward to those conversations a little more than I should have. One evening, we found ourselves leaving the building at the same time. The parking garage was nearly empty. Most employees had gone home hours earlier. "You still work too much," Ethan said. I laughed. "That's rich coming from you." "Fair." We continued walking. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan glanced toward me. "You seem happier." The comment caught me off guard. "Happier?" He nodded. "You smile more." I looked away, a small smile immediately appearing on my face. "Maybe." "No." He smiled. "Definitely." For some reason, hearing that mattered more than it should have, because Ethan had seen me at my worst, not just at the company, at the bus station, when my future felt uncertain, when I was exhausted, when life felt impossibly heavy. And somehow, he still saw something worth believing in. A few days later, I learned Richard had officially left the company. No appeals, no dramatic farewell, just gone. When I heard the news, I expected to feel satisfaction, maybe even vindication. Instead, I mostly felt relief. Relief that I no longer had to carry that weight. Relief that the chapter was finally over. Relief that I could move forward. And for the first time in years, moving forward no longer felt frightening. It felt exciting. What I didn't realize is that Ethan had already been planning one final surprise, one that had nothing to do with promotions, nothing to do with work, and everything to do with a rainy night 3 years earlier. 6 months later, life looked very different. Not perfect, just different. The kind of different that comes after you've survived a season you never thought would end. The company was thriving. The constant chaos had been replaced with structure. Teams worked together more effectively. Employees felt valued. Problems were solved before they became disasters. For the first time in years, walking into the office didn't feel like a burden. It felt like possibility. My new role had challenged me in ways I never expected. There were difficult days, long days, stressful days, but they were the kind of challenges that come from growth, not survival, and that made all the difference. One Thursday evening, I was finishing paperwork when my phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. "Can you stop by my office before you leave?" I smiled.
After 6 months, those messages no longer made me nervous. Curious, yes. Nervous, no. I gathered my things and headed upstairs. The executive floor was mostly empty. The sun was beginning to set beyond the city skyline. Golden light reflected off the windows. The entire floor felt quieter than usual. When I reached Ethan's office, the door was already open. He looked up and smiled. "There you are." I sound relieved. "I was starting to think you'd escaped." I laughed. "Not yet." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Ethan motioned toward a chair. "I wanted to show you something." I sat down. Immediately, I noticed a small package resting on his desk. Simple, wrapped neatly, nothing extravagant. "What is it?" "You'll have to open it." I narrowed my eyes. "That sounds suspicious." His smile widened. "Just open it." Carefully, I removed the wrapping paper, then the lid. The moment I looked inside, I froze. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. It was the same frame that had sat on Ethan's desk for months. Inside was the $20 bill, perfectly preserved, protected behind glass. I stared at it, then looked up at him. "Ethan," his expression softened immediately. "I wanted you to have it." I shook my head. "No." "Yes. I gave that to you. And now I'm giving it back." My eyes returned to the frame. It felt impossible. A single $20 bill. A piece of paper. Yet somehow it carried years of history, years of change, years of growth. Finally, I looked back at him. "I still don't understand." His smile faded into something more serious, something more honest. "What don't you understand?" "Why you kept it." The room grew quiet. Outside, the last light of day slowly disappeared beyond the city skyline. For a moment, Ethan seemed to search for the right words. Then he found them. "When I met you, I thought the world had already decided who I was." I listened quietly. "I thought failure defined me." His voice remained calm. "I thought losing everything meant I wasn't worth much anymore." The honesty in his words immediately brought me back to that rainy night. The exhaustion, the sadness, the loneliness hidden behind his eyes. Ethan looked toward the frame, then back at me. "You didn't see any of that." I frowned. "Of course I did." He shook his head. "No." A small smile appeared. "You saw a hungry stranger." I laughed softly. "That's true." "And you helped him." The room fell silent again. Then Ethan said the one thing that finally made everything click. "It wasn't the money, Ava." My chest tightened. "It was the kindness." His eyes never left mine. "You treated me with dignity when I couldn't find a reason to believe I deserved it." Emotion caught unexpectedly in my throat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan smiled, the same genuine smile I'd first seen at the bus station, the one that always felt completely real. "You reminded me who I wanted to be." I looked down at the frame again, then back at him, then back at the frame again. Finally, I smiled. "You rebuilt your life." I did. "You built an entire company." I did. "You changed hundreds of lives." He nodded, then smiled. "But you started it." I laughed. "That's giving me way too much credit." "Maybe, or maybe not." His smile widened. For several seconds, we simply sat there, neither of us looking away, neither of us pretending anymore. Finally, Ethan stood, walked around the desk, and stopped beside me. "Ava." The way he said my name made my heart skip. "Yes?" For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely nervous. Not CEO nervous, not business nervous, personal nervous. And somehow that made me smile. "Would you have dinner with me?" I blinked, then laughed softly. "That's your big surprise?" He rubbed the back of his neck. Apparently, I couldn't help smiling. 3 years. 3 years since a rainy night at a bus station. 3 years since two strangers shared a conversation neither would ever forget. And somehow, life had brought us back to this moment. I looked at the framed $20 bill, then at Ethan, then back at the frame again. Finally, I smiled. "I'd love to." The relief on his face was immediate, And somehow, seeing that made me even happier. As we left the office together, I found myself thinking about how close we had come to never meeting at all. One delayed bus, one small act of kindness, one decision that seemed insignificant at the time, and yet it changed everything. Sometimes the moments that transform our lives don't feel important while they're happening. Sometimes they're just small choices made on ordinary days. A conversation, a gesture, a helping hand offered without expecting anything in return. 3 years ago, I had given a stranger $20. I thought I was helping him. What I didn't realize was that in ways neither of us could have imagined, we were both saving each other.